Thank you for having me over here this afternoon to talk about the last budget which was delivered yesterday. Of course, being Tax Sutra, you already have a lot of content on tax, and I know that we have also provided a lot of content on tax. So that is something that I will talk a little less about in this round, and I will talk more about the policy and how the budget is working to a process which will have a tremendous impact on the economy. The first and the most important thing of the budget is that, unlike previous years, there has been no large scale tinkering with tax rates. It's all the more um, surprising given that during COVID there has been a huge reduction in revenue, and everybody expected that there would be a clawback of revenue loss. Most interestingly, this budget does not have any new levies, neither in the customs or GST or in the income tax slabs. And solely because of that, I believe there has been a huge relief rally in the stock market. So everybody was bracing themselves for additional taxes. That has not occurred. And that in and of itself has made this a positive budget. The question then here is, how is the government able to do this, especially given the reduction in revenue? And the fundamental issue here is that the deficit in this budget has increased substantially. And why has the government allowed this to increase? This, I believe, is a vote in the Indian economy. The buoyancy that has been brought about post-COVID, this so-called V recovery, and the jury's still out on that, but the V recovery sentiment that is in play here today, in and of itself will provide increased consumption and therefore increased tax collection. The other big ticket issue, of course, here is the aggressive um, agenda for what I'm going to use a word which the government has used. It's not using disinvestment, it is using privatization. And that is a huge mindset change for government in India to say that we are actually going to privatize, and we are going to privatize across sectors, and we will privatize to the point where we will even sell assets that we had nationalized previously. So banks that were nationalized in 1969 are now coming on the anvil to get privatized. And there's a large target of, I believe, 175,000 crores that has been set for this privatization exercise. The government, for the first time, has actually clearly stated the four sectors which it will continue to maintain a role in, but everything else is on the table. The Niti Aayog is supposed to come out with a road plan to sell these assets. And I think the message is that the government will only be in those sectors where it absolutely needs to be, but the government will not be in business. The other contentious issue, which is more sentiment driven than anything else, is the FDI in insurance. It has been a contentious issue for several years right now. And this time the government has actually gone out and said they're going to allow 74% FDI in insurance. Of course, there are safeguards. The board has to be controlled by Indians, and there are other safeguards that need to be put in place. So the devil is always in the detail, but sentiment, mindset, showing the government is open for business and there are no sacred areas which are no-go areas. The government is going to do everything that it needs to do to give a boost to both FDI and private sector. The two other points I want to touch upon briefly is, of course, the increase in spending on healthcare and infrastructure. So healthcare has seen a 137% increase in spending. Honestly, the scale at which India needs investment in healthcare, it is only the government who can roll out that kind of an investment. It has to go down to the lowest common denominator, to the smallest man woman, child in the villages. And this increase in spending is unfortunately come the hard way. Healthcare had been neglected in India for several years. This COVID crisis has opened everybody's eyes, and the government is doing two things. One, they have increased their spending. Two, they have made modifications in the law which will increase the spending in these sectors. So, of course, CSR was done soon as it was announced. There is now exemptions, or there is less compliances for smaller charitable trusts doing education and healthcare in smaller regions. And there is a huge boost in the debt market, and some of that money will invariably find itself into this kind of infrastructure for hospitals and healthcare, which is very, very needed and very, very welcome. The other thing that the government has done, I believe, which is a positive for the economy, is that there is a huge amount of spending on infrastructure. So infrastructure spending does two things. A, of course, it increases the infrastructure which is sorely needed in the country. The second thing it does is that it creates consumption and jobs. So it creates consumptions in steel, cement, and the like. And of course, there are a huge number of jobs created for building out this infrastructure. So the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme has seen a huge uptick during COVID in terms of spend, as well as creation of jobs, and consequently the build out of infrastructure. I believe that is very, very important in this economy. The release of debt into this sector strategically is very, very critical, because this kind of infrastructure cannot be funded either by taxpayers or by the government of India on its own. You need a lot of foreign money coming into it. And I believe the conditions for such kind of investment have been created by this budget. Of course, we can all argue that we need to see it translated into the ground. However, we need to be more optimistic this time, because I believe the lesser the government controls these issues, the more likely it is to happen. And these modifications in terms of public-private partnerships, in terms of reduction of dispute settlement in infrastructure, the processes for procurement, all these things are being changed as the budget is rolled out. So we will definitely see an impact on infrastructure. The other very important aspect of this is that the government is self-perpetuating assets over here. So even in infrastructure, there is a large amount of brownfield monetization on the cards. Again, very important, because if you analyze the build out of infrastructure in India, most projects in India, and I can only think of one as I think this through, other than the Mumbai rail, any other infrastructure, and I'm talking about not Mumbai rail, I'm talking about Mumbai monorail system, any other infrastructure project opened in India, whether it is a highway, whether it is a metro rail system, whether it is a airport, whether it is a seaport, always sees huge consumption, because that is the level of the pent-up demand. The moment you allow these investments to come in a manner that builds these assets, monetizing these is never going to be a problem in the bigger scheme of things. Of course, now a national fast tag policy ensures all the cash is getting collected electronically. There will be large amounts of collection once this is rolled out completely, but all the data seems to suggest that we are on the right track. It is my view that this budget has taken a huge leap forward, A, by strategically putting the right impetus into sectors, and B, actually betting on the people rather than betting on the government by collecting money. We can, of course, look at the tax provisions. We can look at the ambiguity some of it will create. We can look at the desirability or the non-desirability of shutting down the advance appellate ruling body or the settlement commission. But all these things will be small hiccups into a new, more empowered and more confident India as we go out and build our infrastructure, which is so sorely needed in this country. Beyond this, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Suhail, by a quick take, great to have your take, your exhaustive take on the economy. Suhail, by on the single securities market code, combining several legislations, including SEBI, SCRS, so on and so forth. The economic survey mentioned an interesting point about which no one talked yesterday. Over-regulation is the bane of India's economy, is the albatross for India's growth. Do you think enough has been done to ensure that over-regulation, at least we move the first step towards killing over-regulation?
So there are two approaches to this. One is you continue with widespread number of codes, as you have, of course, in the securities market. They're looking to consolidate 4 codes. A better example of this would be the labor codes. 29 labor codes are going to give way to only 4 labor codes. So this is, again, to my mind, a phase that we have to go through in India. Yes, we are over-regulated. I will not say that we are under-regulated, but this is a gradual process. One of the biggest problems for compliance in India is that if you complied with one act, you could potentially have a minefield lurking in another act, which would overlap with the third act. I believe by consolidating this code and making fewer regulators, you will reduce this possibility. So I welcome this. It is less than what we need. There was plans to set up one regulator for the market. However, this is now a securities regulator. Then there was an NFRA aspiration. But I believe, and I have my roots in trade law. And when small FTAs were being signed, the WTO always said that these are building blocks towards the WTO. So one of the things you said, oh, how is the European Union involving free trade within its members and not giving the same benefit to other WTO members? But the position was these are building blocks towards the entire endgame, and these can't be reformed overnight. It will take time, but I think a welcome step in the right direction.
Yeah. And last question, Suhail, by faceless tribunals. The announcement took many, not just by surprise, but I think the reaction was quite underwhelming. We talked to 2 legal eagles, Arvind Datar and Mohan Parasaran earlier today, senior advocates. Both of them seem quite unenthused by this prospect of a faceless ITAT, saying that this definitely violates the principles of natural justice, or at least that was the initial reaction. The response has been quite underwhelming to this prospect of faceless tribunal. Is the government rushing this, especially when faceless assessment and appeals have not yet even started?
So, Arun, the situation here is that this is an intention that has been announced. The government has not rolled out anything. See, there are 2 things. We are now in an era of faceless assessment. And of course, there's a lot to be done. A lot is left to be desired, and is a process. But there are 2 things we can't escape. Okay. One is that there is a huge backlog in India, and we need to find innovative ways to address that. The second situation is that machine learning and artificial intelligence will take its rightful place in governance in due course of time. So until we see what the government intends to do with faceless ITATs, I will reserve my comment. However, I cannot disagree with my 2 renowned and reputable seniors that it is going to be a huge problem. And yes, when the old order changeth, yielding place to new, there will be certain things that are disturbed. So this issue about natural justice, in-person hearing, all these issues that are a given in our constitution and in the old code, we will have to find a way to reconcile. And perhaps if they give a public hearing somewhere before the matter is finally disposed of, maybe that would be a solution. But again, too early until we see what the government has in mind. But backlog will require artificial learning and machine intelligence to
Point taken.
move this.
Suhail bhai. Suhail bhai, one word answer. Do you think this budget has done enough to attract foreign investments? Yes or no?
No, because you can never do enough to attract foreign investments. What always attracts foreign investments in India is the size of the market and the market opportunity. Everything else is off the table because there is always some impediment, some problems. So definitely not enough to attract foreign investment. But look, that's just the nature of the beast.
Suhail bhai, thanks so much. That was Suhail Nathani, managing partner of Economic Laws Practice, one of the eminent lawyers of Mumbai, one of the top law firms in the country. Suhail bhai, thanks so much for sparing your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here, Arun. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Arun.